Hello everyone, welcome. I'm Martina Droth. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Curator of the Yale Center for British Art, and I'm very pleased to be here at the School of Architecture. Thanks to our colleagues for letting us use their building while our own building is currently closed. I'm really thrilled and excited to welcome Flora Yukhnovich and Eleanor Nairne to our program today. Thank you both so much for coming in person. It's so nice to be together and do this, live. Flora Yukhnovich is a painter who, until recently, lived in Britain, but has just relocated to New York. So welcome stateside, Flora. Her paintings are known for melding historical styles. We see glimpses of French rococo and Italian baroque, but merged into this new idiosyncratic language of painting. And she has exhibited very widely internationally, and most recently she had a show at the Wallace Collection in London, which was really wonderful, where her paintings were in conversation with the Wallace Collection, and maybe we'll hear a little bit about that. So Flora will be in conversation with Eleanor Nairne, the Keith and Katherine Sachs Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art and Department Head of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and also a newcomer stateside, because previously Eleanor was the Senior Curator at the Barbican Art Gallery in London, where she curated many really amazing, memorable exhibitions, some of which I had the pleasure to see, including Basquiat, Lee Krasner, John Dubuffet, and Alice Neal. After this conversation that Flora and Eleanor are having, there will be a little bit of time for discussion, so join us for that. Please join me in welcoming Flora and Eleanor.
Thank you so much for that lovely, warm introduction. Hello, Flora. Can everyone hear us okay? We had a very jolly mic check that some of you joined us for. Just want to be sure that everybody at the back can hear. Okay, great. So as you mentioned in your introduction, we are both relatively new to living stateside, and I think one of the last substantial bits of correspondence between us was regarding your global talent visa. So I thought we might start there with just a question about what brings you to these fair shores. What made you decide that you wanted to come and spend some time in America?
Wait, can you hear me yet? Mixture of things. First of all, I've been in London for about 15 years now, and it just feels like I'm ready for a change, live in a midlife crisis. And also, I don't know, I've watched New York on TV for so long, but when I came about 3 years ago, I was like, this is my home. And I just wanted to come and enjoy the museums and look at art and experience New York. I feel like it's sort of loomed so large, like it's a sort of mythological place in a lot of my research, so to actually be there felt kind of important.
And there are kind of two aspects of this. People say to me a lot, how does it feel to have moved to America? Because I moved here in February. And, we can't neatly cleave our lives between the personal and the professional. But I do sometimes want to answer, in terms of what it means for me as a human and then what it might mean for my work. And I know that as a painter, one is always making decisions in relation to both, and they don't necessarily want the same thing. Did you feel like it was both you and your work that wanted to come and be stateside?
Yeah, it was, for sure. I think a lot of my work has been about European influence, and I've always been really drawn to the abstract expressionist painters, and I don't know, film and things like that. So the idea of coming here and maybe after having spent sort of several years looking at that side of my practice, it felt like it would be really nice to spend some time drilling down into the other stuff.
Amazing. And one of the first moments at which Flora and I got to know each other was when I was doing a big retrospective of Lee Krasner's work in London, which opened in 2019. And Flora very generously was one of a number of contemporary artists who agreed to do a short video speaking about Krasner's work, because one of the reasons why we did that show was because there hadn't been a show since Brian Robertson's at the Whitechapel in 1965, so it was somewhat overdue. There was one work in a public collection, in Tate's collection, and so artists who had grown up in London had had very low exposure to her work. And when we did a studio visit, I got to see some of your paintings that were very much complete, fully grown adults ready to be in the professional world, and I got to see some which were young infants, maybe not even yet fully verbal. And some of those early paintings had very, very striking resonances with American abstraction in ways that I think people who have only seen your finished works wouldn't necessarily know about the story of those underpaintings. Can you tell us a little bit about what do the early days of a life in one of your paintings look like?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I always think of myself as a figurative painter who's trying to draw myself back to abstraction, but I think you're right, like those earlier ones, like the earlier stages, I guess, is that simpler and then just about paint. They do feel more like that. I think at the beginning it's just about, I'm always thinking figuratively, so I'm always thinking about light, colour, and tone, things like that, and form. So at the beginning it's just about getting the colour of the light that I want, whether I want it to be like a digital blue light or like a kind of historical, kind of dusty old yellow light. And then from there I just sort of established sort of the darker patches.
And are you priming? How are you priming? Go on, give us the full technical detail, come on.
2 layers of waxing glue and then oil primer, which I really like because it stays kind of slippery and I can wipe stuff off as I go. So I love that, being able to move things around and mix them together on the surface and literally wipe off at the end of the day if it's a total disaster. It's like such a relief. But yeah, I think at the beginning it's like trying to get this sort of crackle in the paint, trying to get as much like, where the brush like scrapes through a mark and you can kind of see the canvas underneath, and try and get that sort of reflection of light through the paint to get as much personality of the paint that I then will react to, and it sort of dictates what I end up adding, and it kind of leads the way for the rest of the work.
So it means you have these big gestures that sit underneath these paintings. There's a huge amount of energy that goes into them, and one of the things I think you've often said when you're speaking about your work, which is a simple statement, a humble statement, but one that continues, it's something I think about every day when I look at painting, is the relationship of painting, and specifically oil painting, as you're working with, to time. The fact that somebody, a novelist, a poet, a composer, is producing a piece of work which we will experience durationally. You as a painter are making something which, at least in the first instance, a person will relish in an instant. And a huge amount of time has gone into that. First with those kind of big gestural strokes and then working it kind of into detail. How do you feel then about the question of time? We have this wonderful slideshow of images of some of your earlier work. What does it then feel like when you look at a painting from 3 years ago, say, or from 5 years ago? How is your relationship with time once something has long left the studio?
Well, I just had a show open in Wardrobe Garden, Copenhagen, and it's a mixture of loans and newer works. And it's really weird actually to see how much just the surface has changed in 6 years or something. It's sort of, I think I step back from the work more and they feel somewhat more sure of what the imagery is, because I think the way I paint is that I will put marks down and then sort of try and determine some kind of imagery within it, and I'll sort of collage into that and I'll find the painting as I go. And so then for the next work I have like a selection of images now which emerged in the last work that I could then use in that. So it's like they like really know what they're going to become a bit more, and they're a bit more sure of themselves. But it's interesting, the idea of trying to get something which does say which does do everything all at once and then also does it slowly again, so that you have that first initial impact when you see a work, and then try and create some sort of journey through it or intrigue that will help the viewer to unpack that and sort of digest it slower or something. That's sort of, I think, what I'd like to get in the work with such a challenge.
Did you feel like you wanted to go back into any of the paintings?
Oh my God, all the time.
Yeah, because that's the challenge when you have a kind of very slow build practice like that. I think there's always the temptation to think you can add another sprinkle of salt.
Yeah, and it's also not linear. It's not like they start with these big brushstrokes and then end up small. I will sometimes just paint white over an entire part of the canvas and sort of start that fresh. I honestly think that they could go on forever, and obviously the surface will look different and things, but I think in terms of the image, it's hard to ever let them go because it could evolve forever and ever.
So I'm going to narrowly resist asking you every artist's most loathed question, which is, how do you know when a painting is finished? And instead I'm going to ask you about Doja Cat, because I think one of the things that has always been, maybe frustration is too strong, but I've certainly always been very conscious of with your work, is, we'll talk in a minute maybe about your beginnings really in figuration, in portraiture, but you've certainly become known as someone who, amongst other things, is really, really good at messing with the rococo. And you can see that very clearly within the paintings that are playing out behind us. There are all sorts of clever aspects to that which you might not be aware of, like the way in which you control the palette that you're working within and those sorts of illusions. But there are many, many other layers of references as well. And I remember the kind of delight I took when I was really getting into one of your pinboards of references and seeing that you had Doja Cat and you had Beyonce and you had these kind of pop stars and you had Instagram references, and the show that we were speaking about a lot was your Victoria Miro show, Thirst Trap. And I wonder whether you being in America, dare I say it, they might have a bit more ease at recognising some of those aspects within the painting. Do you feel like they get spoken about as much?
It's my challenge really with the work in that the historical references that I use always come to me through something contemporary. I've always seen some music video or I don't know, like a children's toy or something that makes me want to use a bit of tissue or something like that. Don't ask. But I think there's something about painting that immediately makes it historical. So it's this sort of tug of war. I'm trying to drag stuff to something more contemporary, and I think being here will hopefully help just lighten some of the historical load so that they can feel a little bit more like they resonate with the stuff that I'm interacting with every day that feels maybe more relevant to my life. If that makes sense.
How does Katy Perry feel relevant to your life?
She doesn't really, to be honest.
There is a painting that's named after Katy Perry, so I'm not just being mean.
It was. I mean, it was a while ago.
Okay, fine. We've moved on from Katy Perry. There are all sorts of new references within that. I mean, certainly, I delight in that sense of the high and the low, of the idea that there's something delicious in that something can be wet in a sense that is a reference to Boucher, but it can also be wet in a sense that is a reference to a kind of Instagram thirst trap. And why do we need to demand that something exists in one cultural space rather than slipping between the two? That is maybe a more just real reflection of the kind of plethora of imagery that we're all saturated with on a daily basis. And I guess it's very tempting when people look at your paintings just to ground them in those art historical references and not to allow the whole kind of smorgasbord to have a place.
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing is how the sources are connected. For me, that's what makes me want to make the painting. It's the idea that it's not like it's the contemporary references from other artists, and everything sort of is sort of a tumble of information through history that might have started as like a painting in the 16th century, and then ends up being on like a sparkly toy or something like that. And there's something so appealing to me about being able to try and make sense of the world in that way, and try and understand the layers of meaning and how they can be deposited over time, to the point where we think we understand the world around us, and like, what is it to try and unpick that? That's what I want paintings to do.
One of the things I've often noticed in our conversations about art, and specifically your art, is how frequently we come back to food metaphors, or how close food always seems. I think I'm often tempted to talk about these images of being gorgeous, but there's also something within that of the gorging, of a sense of kind of decadence and bacchanalia, and the kind of knife edge between those two things. I was saying earlier about a smorgasbord. I think that sort of sense of abundance, and we can place that within French 18th century painting. But I wonder whether you're conscious of the way in which those delectable kind of references are there or close to hand within your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I'm painting, it feels like, like if you eat like 15 donuts and you feel kind of horrified with yourself and you've got like sugar on your fingers and stuff. It's sort of like it's so gorgeous but also so dirty, and you have to kind of get on with it and try and enjoy it in its two things, which is both disgusting and wonderful at the same time. There is something that feels like really foody about the material of paint, and something about food which speaks about like excess and like consumerism and things, and I feel like all of those things dance around what painting is in its like purest essence and like as a material.
There's a lot to digest there.
You're
so welcome. You're so welcome. The whole thing was set up for that. I feel like we should give a little bit of context to how you came to be a painter, because I think there are aspects of that which are very specific in relation to your training. So maybe you want to say a bit about what it was like in an earlier moment of your life, to be doing portrait painting, for instance. And we can talk a little bit about city and guilds, because I think for some people here they might not be aware of the kind of specificity of that as an art school.
Well, so my first kind of bit of art education was my foundation course at Kingston, and I specialised in graphic design, and I loved that kind of analysing meaning, colour and stuff like that, sort of looking at how meaning is carried by different aesthetics. But I really missed like that thing of working with your hands and making something. And so I went and did this portrait course, which was quite formal in that it was a model in front of just sort of like a backdrop, and we would do, it's always from life, we'd do 3 weeks setups, and we had a different tutor for each 3 weeks who would teach their method. So it wasn't like this one specific method, but it was just painting every day. And there was no real decision in what we were painting. It was just the only decisions you could make for how you were going to paint it. And it was like the best boot camp in painting ever, because the only thing you're focusing on was how you mix the colour, what direction it's going to go in on the canvas. But I think that idea of painting and looking at the body meant that all of the references I was looking at, all of the other artists I was looking at, were dealing with ideas of the body and flesh. And that idea of flesh and paint being really sort of bound together in my mind, I think, came from that period. After that, I just painted these like quite lumpy self-portraits for a while, and then it just sort of dried up. I sort of fell so in love with paint that I was expecting it to do something really marvellous and magic and transform and sort of become alive. And the weight of, I suppose, like fanciful ideas about paint became sort of impossible to deal with, and I didn't know how to move forward. So that's when I decided to do an MA. And during that time, I sort of and funnest stuff that I could think of, and try and look at things that had never occurred to me would be something that you would paint, looking at flat patterns and sort of repeat shapes and things like that. And it was just an amazing time of sort of exploring the limits of what painting could be and why paint was like the main question for that year.
But I feel like all of that training is very rigorous technical training, which certainly I really feel very powerfully when I stand in front of one of your works, is I think this is somebody who has a real command of her medium in a way that is not always true. If somebody, for instance, might have had a much more conceptual training, that might feel less what they're concerned about within painting. They might be much more kind of invested in other aspects of what paint can articulate, whereas I feel like you have a dialogue with paint that is so much about it as a medium. You have often worked within this limited 8 colours. I don't know if that's still the case. Yeah?
So I still use the same 8 colours that I learned with when I was on my portrait course. And they're not limited really. I think you can do...
They can take you almost anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's funny because I think my whole, everything I do is from a place of trying to work out how I can paint more and how I can make painting that would be relevant now. And I think that maybe some other artists would have an idea and then they would decide this would be best in paint. Mine is sort of, my journey's been the other way around in that I'm absolutely obsessed with paint, and that leads to any other idea, it just comes out of the material first, I think.
And that makes a lot of sense to me in terms of many of the artists who come to mind when I think about your work. So when we're not talking about Boucher or Doja Cat, I think somewhere in between those things, there is a real kind of pantheon of British artists, actually, you know, whether that be Jenny Saville and her handling of flesh, whether it be Cecily Brown, certainly is somebody who comes to mind, of course Albach and others in the post-war period who were really kind of working up into this very kind of striking painterly landscape. Who are some of the painters that you feel you keep close to you in the studio, or whose work you perhaps turn to more frequently outside of the 18th century?
Yeah, it's difficult because I feel like when you're learning to paint, your heroes loom so large that you have to actually deliberately turn your back on them at some point because they really creep into the work. So Jenny Saville is someone who, like every figurative painter in the world, I study very closely. I think it started with Freud, then it went to Albach and Jenny Saville, and then at City and Guilds it was Cecily Brown, who, really the idea that she was using art history to express herself, and sort of my realization that the only way to paint, or if you're painting now, you always reference art history, and that she's doing it consciously. It just sort of clicked to me that was the most logical thing that anyone could do, and it seemed like that was just what I had to do. People come and go, and I think, I don't know who at the moment is my big person. I'm
okay, so you haven't figured out who you're inviting to your dream dinner party yet. But I think Cecily Brown is also an interesting kind of reference point for me in that there's also that sense of a digital glitch in some of her work. That is something that I sense quite strongly in yours sometimes. So many painters would say that really in their essence what they are trying to do is make paint move, create something that has that sense of movement. Anyone who has never made a painting themselves, I think sometimes doesn't always appreciate the subtlety and complexity of trying to make a static object feel like it has movement to it. And I think one of the ways you go about that is the fact that you're thinking about light and movement from the very beginning, but you're also thinking about light and movement as they exist in digital spaces. So the backlight of an iPhone or a laptop, the sense of movement that you might get in a slideshow like this, or indeed in a kind of in an ad on social media. How do you think about that? I guess that question of movement, and I'm kind of particularly interested in it in relation to this duality that's there in your work between the organic and the synthetic. I feel like I look at one of your paintings and I can see a peony opening in a time-lapse video.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I do feel like it's when you first start and you have big marks, that's when it's the most movement, and it's you trying to like just hold on to that throughout the process. But there's like putting your body into it. How much movement, how much like force can you get behind something? How much spray from the brush that's going to look like movement? And there are like sort of contrived bits that you can use, like I don't know if you think about like cartoons or comic books, the way they make movement. They have like little spirals around something if they're spinning, or they'll have like little lines. And I think there are ways to make that with paint so it looks like, it feels like movement, and you sort of understand that without necessarily, you can kind of bury it into the language in some way, but I think it still helps. And then I think there's something about the viewer, trying to get them to move around the work, to keep things mildly obscured so that they want to sort of see it from a different angle, have things that feel like they're collapsing into themselves and reforming. Yeah, I think ultimately that's, and maybe something about like shifting light and getting the complementaries right so that it kind of, they sort of shimmer if they're in the right light. Yes, it's difficult, I do. It's like a never-ending challenge.
And they're large. You know, these are, it's so great that you've, Flora made this slideshow presentation, and you can see you've put all the sizes in there, which I'm really pleased about, in metric, just to keep you all on your toes. But I am really pleased about, because, you know, some of these are enormous, and certainly taller than you, or, you know, kind of more sizable than your body. And how do you think about the scale of some of these works in relation to your body as you're making them? Do you want them to feel like a kind of viewing space that is immersive in some way, or overwhelming?
Yeah, definitely. I think sometimes it's about making it feel, overwhelming and huge, or something, or maybe like making it feel cinematic or something. But I love facing up to a big white canvas that's bigger than me, and like just
wrestling with it.
Yeah, it's amazing. There's something about the sort of one-to-one ratio of the energy from my body that then goes onto the canvas, and I always find it difficult scaling down and doing sort of a mid-size and trying to capture that same kind of weight behind the brush when you're actually just doing that.
Well, it's very easy for it to get precious, and I think a word that has become quite dirty in certain spaces is the idea of the decorative, which obviously is extremely loaded in terms of gender, and I think you've been very conscious of that, but it's very easy for those gestures on a smaller scale to feel quite decorative.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm cheating, because putting it on a large scale, it's like if you took like a gesturing painted rose that's on a piece of wrapping paper and you blew it up, it would suddenly become this like big, gory, exciting thing. The question is like, how do you take decorative languages and unravel them so that they can, on any scale, make you feel all sorts of different things and you can kind of access them? It's sort of a challenge.
Do you have a sense, as and when you've had a couple of really important institutional moments recently at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, at the Wallace Collection in London, you mentioned the show that you've just had in Denmark. Do you feel, and maybe this is just like flattering to my work in institutions, but I often notice that those can be important breaches for an artist in terms of saying, okay, that marks the end of this body of work, and where do I kind of want to go next? Can you feel yourself sort of shifting in terms of where you go?
Yeah, I think so. I've sort of been mulling over what the work will become and sort of thinking about it as I move here. And yeah, I do. I think with those projects specifically as well, because they were looking at sort of specific moments in art history, there was something about them that was incredibly helpful because they were quite restrictive in some ways, and it forced me into different sort of corners of my practice. But I think what it's shown me is really where where these outlier kind of interests are, and I'm excited to try and combine those together and maybe strip away some of the historical, the sort of clear historical link, and talk about things like excess, talk about things like mania, like binging, fandom, just the sort of muchness of it, and try and think about that in a slightly different way that's maybe less reliant on like the rococo, but is more, more to do with paint, I suppose, and less to do with the imagery. I feel like I go in and out of painting that's about paint and about art making, and then it's about kind of more image-based stuff.
Different forms of gorgeousness then. Different forms of gorging.
Yeah,
Gorging.
More gorging.
More gorging.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that will be so interesting to see, we started this conversation thinking about what it is for you to arrive on American shores. I feel very conscious that we're like somewhere in between right now, but I think certainly for me, one of the reasons why people move away from home is to be able to have a kind of slightly giddy sense of freedom, or feel able to explore different kinds of creative territories. It's very difficult for us to each know what kind of cultural baggage we're holding when we're also immersed in that as our everyday ambient culture. So I sense that might be kind of exciting too, to feel like, of course, there are lots of people here excited to see what you're going to do, but in London you've become a very known artist within our contemporary art sphere, and do you have any of that sense of kind of giddiness about just being kind of away from all that?
Honestly, I have that every time I finish a body of work. I kind of hate my work by the time it leaves the studio, and I couldn't be more happy to have it returned to me as this like fresh place that anything could happen. So I suppose I'm feeling that just like times 100. And I've done some residencies, and I found that when I was on the residencies, I had all these intentions for what I thought the work was going to become, and sort of did, but there were like vast changes in things like colour palette and things like just sort of the fundamentals of the work that I didn't realise was happening at the time. So I'm hoping that all this like magic that I'm not in control of will just sort of creep into the work.
I have every confidence in the capacity of magic to creep into your work. I'm conscious that we have a lot of people here and some very echoey microphones. Does anyone want to ask Flora any questions? We have a couple of microphones to go round, if you would, so you might just wait for one of those to reach you.
Hey Flora, thank you so much. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the origins of the titles of many of your paintings, because often they feel quite loaded with meaning. Sometimes they're really obviously referential, and sometimes they're a little bit, more secretive than that, maybe to the viewer. And you talk about how everything for you begins with the paint and kind of ends with the paint. So how does the title become implicated in that?
Well, yeah, so I think it's because I've seen something that reminds me of painting. There's something contemporary. So sometimes the title will come from that very first idea, but often it will come from the process. Like I write down little phrases and things like that just to try and hold feelings in my mind, or like quotes from films and things, just to try and like help myself to get to that place in front of the work. And so sometimes those will become the titles, just a little like placeholding things. And sometimes it's a way of dragging, like I was saying, like that, like trying to tug something back into the contemporary that, it's mostly from stuff that I I don't know, it's like my top play on Spotify, but the things that I have really enjoyed and loved over the years and like have really stuck in my mind, sort of end up serving themselves up and feeling kind of helpful. Because I love the idea that they're Googleable and you could bring in a whole different kind of reference, a whole different sort of source that could sit parallel with the work.
I'm really glad you asked that, because I think they are an important component in terms of for a viewer. And often I think they give like a little helping hand to someone who might not necessarily have got the second edge. Like I'm thinking of a work like Bombshell, for instance, where you have that immediate collision of beauty and ballistics, you know, and you can see that in the work, that energy. But a title really is like a gentle underline to say, don't miss this.
Yeah, I love puns and dualities. So the idea that something could have sort of bring in multiples is very exciting to me.
Hi, Flora. The first time I saw one of your works, I was most struck by it. The first thing that struck me was the color palette and the very rococo feeling of the work. And earlier in this talk, you mentioned that you only use 8 colors. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how you came to those 8 colors and maybe how your feelings towards your understanding of those colors have changed and evolved throughout your time as an artist from that first class to now.
Yeah, so it was so each tutor that came and taught us brought along their own palette. And so it was sort of halfway through that a tutor came, and it's a slightly different palette that he brought, but essentially it's a cool and a warm version of each colour, and a transparent and an opaque version of each colour. So it sort of has like very good scope for achieving a lot with it. It's become like second nature to me in a way to mix the colours. I love working with it. I probably wouldn't want to switch out anything now. But yeah, I don't know how my relationship has changed with it. I feel like the problem with mixing my own colours is sometimes I get stuck in a colour palette and it's quite difficult. It's like muscle memory takes you to a particular mixture, and I suppose like it can become a bit of a challenge to try and disrupt that in the next body of work. So I found myself swinging a bit between like red paintings and blue paintings to try and like break the pattern.
Thank you so much. This is really, really interesting. I have a question related to a comment that you made earlier in the talk. You said painting immediately makes it historical. And I was really struck by that because, of course, there is painting. Of course, lots of paintings are historical, but I couldn't help but think of that Baudelaire quote, like, every old master had his own modernity. So it's not for me the subject that makes things always historical, but I'm curious to know, like, do you feel there's something about the medium of paint itself that is out of our contemporary moment that led you to that statement?
Yes, yeah, for sure. I think paint, canvas, paintbrushes, all of those things speak to art history. Like, you could make anything now. And in many ways, it's one of the worst mediums to communicate something. You'd probably want to make a film or write a book, or I don't know, there's so many other things you could do. What's compelling about painting is that it's got this history to it, it's got this internal logic, these questions that history asks about it, and this build-up of language. I think that, yeah, you can't get away from it. It's like you just can't paint today without referencing history. That's I think.
And maybe you know this, that for the Wallace exhibition, Flora's paintings were both framed on the staircase, and the bouchers that they had replaced were taken out of their frames and exhibited on white walls downstairs. I thought, as a curator, that's such a simple device, but so powerful to say, you know, yes, these things, all things belong to history, but it's also about the ways in which we frame them that has such an impact on how we receive them as contemporary or historical.
I'm just curious about tradition in British painting. You have a marvelous tradition in England, and do you ever look back at any of the other artists who preceded you and take anything from their work? In terms of inspiration, or color, or what?
Obsessively. Yeah. Like, I don't know, because, yeah, I think, I can't really look at, because I started painting before I started looking at paintings, I can't look at paintings without greedily trying to work out how I can take something from my own work. I'm always just like shopping. So I think all the time.
Hi Flora, I'm an undergraduate here at Yale and studying painting, and I was wondering, do you have any advice for young artists hoping to achieve success in the art world, professional and commercial scale? I really admire your work.
Thank you. I think, well, when I first graduated, I think people were sort of very quick to discuss how quickly the work would change, and whether it should change quickly because, like, don't get stuck in a rut, or it shouldn't change because, you know, you really need to work out what your style is. And I definitely found myself racing through material too fast, and as a result, it stays interesting to me, and I come back to it like a year later, and I've been doing these sort of circles through things that interest me. And I think the best advice that I would give is to get intensely bored of whatever you're looking at, so that you never come back to it, and then you'll keep moving forward, I think, and the work will keep being interesting to you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. The question about framing, and we talked a lot about paint, but we haven't talked about so much about linen, but my basic question is, do you long for a ceiling?
Sorry?
Do you long to paint on a different surface, to like a ceiling, a dome ceiling, or am I putting too much history onto your work? But I see ceiling painting.
Yeah, no, I love ceiling painting. I quite like the play of taking it and putting it on a canvas. Yeah, I like the idea of taking sort of like decorative languages from like porcelain and putting it into a canvas. I would love to do the opposite. I would really love to make some porcelain or like work with like glazing stuff. And I really want to do some work with wallpapers and things like that.
Hi. Thinking about what you said about moving to New York and your hope that that move might open up new paths in your painting, I'm wondering if you've seen anything since you've moved to New York, either art or not art, that's particularly struck you.
Yes, definitely. I'm trying to think which one, what to mention. There's so much. Yeah, I don't know. It's I'm looking at very specific things. I'm sort of out shopping for like solutions to ideas I have. I went to the Morgan Library the other day, and that red library room and the way that it's all displayed, all the velvets and the kind of display cases with the beautiful china objects and stuff. I thought that was really interesting. I'd quite like to kind of explore displaying work, maybe in some setting like that.
Can't wait what else you're going to discover in New York. I just wanted to come back to something you said about, so this conversation about history is really interesting. And you said something like lightening the historical load. So that sounds as though you have both sort of drawn to these historical reference points, almost like you can't help it and it's right there in the canvas in the way you just described. But you also want to lighten the historical load. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that kind of tension.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I like tension. It sort of like helps me make work if I feel a bit confused about how I feel about something. But yeah, I think it's sort of, I admire those old paintings so much, and I sort of, you know, study them all day and they're in my work. But then I also love like TV, and I don't know, I love the internet, and that feels maybe more like me in some ways. So it's sort of trying to find myself through those old paintings and trying to find some way of I don't know, it's like, I think that the experience of the world is kind of, you experience it through these sort of fractured different media, if that makes sense, and it's trying to create an impression of the present through those different facets. And I suppose that's the struggle, is not to get lost in it and to try and keep the work relevant, so it's saying something that feels contemporary and feels personal and feels like me, if that makes sense.
Thanks. I have one more sort of building on Martina's. Do you have an ideal viewer when you imagine someone looking at your work? What are they doing? How long do they stay there? How do they get engaged with it in the world that you just described that otherwise is very fractured?
Yeah, I do, and I feel that when I'm making the work, it starts with this really quiet white studio that then gets filled with my work, and as I get closer to showing the work, it's like I feel these viewers like coming closer and like knocking at the door. But I really enjoy the idea that lots of people see lots of different things. Some people might be able to see all of the art struggle references, some people won't, they'll take it just for the emotional feeling of it. But when I'm thinking about viewer, I think about people exactly like me with the exact same set of references. And yeah, I guess that's what I can do. Any other questions?
I've only seen one of your works in the flesh, so to speak, and it was the big painting at the Hirshhorn. And it was towards the end of that show that I kind of caught that work, and I was totally blown away by it. And I kept sort of doing a double take. Is this something new, or is this some weird rococo painting that's got into this exhibition? And I think that generally I was just, amazed by the real beauty of the work and the complexity of your painting. But my question is, have you ever thought of trying to paint something that's really ugly?
It was all I thought for a long time, because I thought that was serious painting. So I would paint myself mostly and make myself as ugly as possible and make really ugly paintings, and I felt like it was like really important work. And I think that there's something about beauty that feels cheap and unserious and playful, and for me it's really freeing, and I enjoy feeling like there's something unserious about my work all the time.